My next guest in the waiting room, Jo Phillips, is a former Rugby League player and coach for the Wakefield Trinity Women's Club. She is also a survivor of sexual abuse, post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and suicide. Despite these incredible challenges and obstacles that Jo has faced, her story truly is that of recovery, transformation, and that incredible spirit and one value that we all need, and that is of hope. It is my great privilege and pleasure to welcome my next guest in the waiting room, Jo Phillips. Thank you so much for being here with us. Thank you so much for sharing your journey with us.
That's absolutely my pleasure. I think we've all got a story to tell, and sometimes those stories are difficult. Maybe it's dark, but I think that they need telling anyway.
I'm so grateful. And as with so many of my guests, the place that I'd like to begin your journey is beginning with who your parents are.
Yeah, so I was adopted from a young age, 6 weeks old. So for me, my adoptive parents were always my parents. I can't remember my biological parents. And I think the whole process for me, the adoption process, I've got 11 siblings, biological siblings, and I'm in contact with them. And for them, that process was quite difficult, that lack of identity. Often the people that go for adoption might encounter. For me, it was never like that. I remember being told from a very young age that I was adopted. I'm mixed race as well, so I think they felt it was important to tell me. And I think they made it sound such a beautiful process. I remember very vividly my mum describing to me how they went. I don't know how true her kind of recollection is, how she tells it, but that there was these babies and they went and they picked me, and they knew as soon as they saw me that their hearts fell in love with me. And I think that for me gave me a real sense of feeling special, of feeling chosen, of feeling wanted and loved.
We're going to discuss the events that occurred approximately for the age of 6. And Jo, I've heard you speak, I've read your messages, and I've always been deeply moved. And the sense I've always had is less so of what happened to you, but more of just how incredibly strong you are and how you've grown from all of those things that you had to suffer from. For everyone that's listening, this is a trigger warning. We will be discussing themes of sexual abuse, of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, suicide. And I thank you so much again for the unbelievable courage that you've demonstrated. And if I may ask for you to show that courage once again and tell us what happened from the ages of 6.
I have a recollection from the age of 6 of what occurred. But I later discovered pictures of myself when I was a baby, and the other children from a very young age that were very sexually explicit. So it was my grandparents and their next door but one neighbour, and 2 individuals that I don't know who they were. They were not they weren't present all the time. They were only present in those moments. So my grandparents, it was my dad's father and his stepmom, and I absolutely doted on them. They were very much pillars of the community, and I loved them, as you're supposed to with your grandparents, and I used to want to go and stay and visit with them. And my first recollection of the abuse occurring, which I didn't recognise obviously, was they would ask me to take off my clothes and put on lipstick, and they would take photographs on a Polaroid camera. And as a young child who, I trusted them, I loved them, they loved me, and for me this was all a game. This was all something that was, something that was good. And initially that's how it kind of started. And I suppose, like many people, victims of abuse and survivors of sexual abuse, you know, in those first instances, especially when it's somebody, which it largely is people that you know, people that you're entrusted to, you don't recognise it. You think that that's love. You think that everybody that's how that love, that's an expression of their love for you, and you're expressing your love back for them. And that, over the years, is something that it absolutely corrodes your soul, because you carry shame and guilt and blame, misplaced obviously, but you carry that. So for me, it started off, what I thought at the time was just how we all loved each other.
Absolutely. And in many ways, if I may say so, they manipulated you with the things that they would say to you, the things that they would get for you. And can you educate us into how that happened and what that environment was like before we speak a little bit more explicitly about exactly the trauma that you suffered?
So like I say, I think initially everything, I mean, the nature of any form of abuse is coercion and manipulation, and that is very subtle and succinct, and it is done in a way that makes you trust in them. And I think that never comes really in a hostile way. It comes in a way that is very much, it looks and appears like love. So it was presence, it was telling me that how much they loved me, it was telling me that I was so special. It was all of those things that made me feel safe in what was occurring to me, and not to question it. And again, you know, when I go and stay, I had initially what I thought was a beautiful experience, a beautiful time, and that's why I was always eager to go and stay there for the summer holidays, or because they would take me on cinema trips. You know, where's my parents? They didn't have the money really for those things, and obviously, you know, with work. So there it was kind of, everything was beautiful. Everything was how you would want it to be. It was idealistic. It was, you know, if somebody had said, what would you like to do in the holidays? Everything that I would have said, they ensured that we did. And that kind of gave you a sense of feeling that you were safe in all this. And actually this was something that was good and positive, when in actuality it wasn't.
I ask this next question, Jo, again, only with your permission, and once more to show that courage you've had in talking about these things. But also importantly, there will be people listening now who have suffered sexual abuse. There will also be people watching and listening who are sexual abusers. And I feel sometimes that we hide under the umbrella of sexual abuse and not appreciate the brutality of it, and just what form that trauma can take. If you would be kind enough and gracious enough to tell us exactly what your grandparents put you through and the roles that they played in that.
So like I say, initially it was all felt like I was dressing up and so forth, but it took, I think, very much, once they earn your trust, and they're very adept at and masterful at being disingenuous but appearing to be these, you know, great human beings. But it took a very dark turn, and I think they used to dress their living room up, cover it all in plastic, you know, things that you would use when you were decorating, to ensure that they kept the furniture and the carpets clean. And there was 2 other children who were the children of 2 of the abusers. And they would basically bath us in Dettol separately. We would have to stand naked in the hallway, and then they would insist that we were bathed in Dettol. And then we would either be called into the living room, we had to face the wall, would either be called into the living room separately or together, where they would violate us in ways that, you know, suddenly I'd went from this kind of gentle touching almost that never felt invasive and never felt painful and never felt brutal, to suddenly being violated in ways that, as a little body, was never intended to endure. And it was it was brutal, you know. And then they would, after they had performed and violated us and abused us, they would then bathe us in Dettol again. And I think at the time, again, it was just, I didn't even dare cry, you know, I was kind of numb. But I think when I look back, the Dettol, bathing us in Dettol prior to it, to then do the things that it did to us, that felt like one of the most kind of soul-crushing things for me, because it was almost, they cleaned us up to dirty us, and then they cleaned us up again as though nothing had happened. And I think that was one of the main parts that I struggled with.
You talked to us of how important it was to you of feeling wanted, and one of your favourite stories at bedtime and really any time was how you were picked and how you were chosen. Some of the things that your grandparents told you was to use that against you, and can you share with us what that was?
Yeah, so they would say to us, because obviously I was adopted, and they would tell me, my grandmother would tell me that if ever I told anybody, you know, they would be so upset with me that they would give me away again. And the fear of that, you know, was something that, you know, it's a tactic that a lot of abusers use, is to silence you, is to remove your voice. And they do that by using fear, whether it be violence, whether it be something a little bit more subtle, you know, because you're a child, you have no comprehension that that's never going to happen. You know, you don't know the legalities of adoption. You just think that you were given away to another family who wanted you. But if that family didn't want you anymore, you'd be given away. And the thought of that was enough to keep me entrapped in silence.
And the last thing I want to ask about this period before we talk about you and the impact it had, again in the interests of appreciating what people who have suffered abuse go through, can you tell us a few more details of the things that you had to experience, if you're comfortable?
Yeah, so one of the things that they did was, my grandma never actually, the other lady involved in the abuse, she abused us, but my grandma was never, she orchestrated it all. And she would take the photographs, but she never actually engaged in the sexual abuse herself in terms of the violation, but she was obviously very complicit. But they would urinate on us, masturbate on us, they would do penetrative sex, demand that we did or performed oral sex on them. They would use objects, household objects, you know. They would wear gloves, and it was all things that, you know, I'd never, you know, I didn't even know about sex, you know, at that age, and it was, I was just kind of clothed in not knowing or understanding what on earth was occurring. All I knew was that it hurt and that it made me scared. And when I said to stop, they told me to stop being a baby, you know, and to remember, you know, what they told me. And again, you would be very subdued. And it was, we never spoke to each other when we went out after each one of us, and we had to sometimes engage in acts with each other as children. And then we'd go and we'd stand in the hallway and we had to face the wall and not talk. And I think that there was an unspoken language between us, and I think we all knew that this was desperately wrong.
Yes.
And by this point we didn't know, but that was their parents. And I think for me, when I grew up, one of the hardest things for me in what happened was feeling that at least I got to go home to parents who loved me, who nurtured, protected me in the best ways they could. They had to stay there.
Absolutely.
And I think that was something that did then, even quite young, and still now, and I think forever, will be something that they're like ghosts to me. It haunts me.
What would happen after the abuse, after you'd been washed, after the plastic covers had been taken? Would everything return to normal, as if nothing unusual had happened?
It was, when I look back now, it was just incredulous how it happened. You know, it would literally be as though nothing had occurred. So it would then be, they would go home back to their house, and then my grandmother with my granddad would go. He also kept birds, and he'd go down his aviary. And then it would be my grandma would be asking me what I wanted for my tea, and everything would just be go in the pantry and get yourself some sweeties if you want, and, you know, put on the TV what you want. And it was, you know, and there was times where I was so sore from what had happened, I just wanted to lay on my bed. And she'd come up, if that was the case, she'd come up and she'd tuck me in and she'd say, I've brought you something to eat. And it was the most conflicting, confusing time as a young child, because it was literally as though nothing had happened. And I always remember feeling that when they put that plastic down, for whatever reason, it was not a home anymore. It was so clinical and dark. There was a real kind of ambience, but a very dark ambience. And then it lifted, and then it was a home again, and it was filled with the news on the television, or it was filled with the radio, and, you know, nice home cooked food, that everything that a home would be. And it was probably, it was so confusing as to what really was occurring.
And Jo, you've told us about really the beautiful upbringing you've had, and I think the way that your parents told you about how you were adopted was so beautiful and gentle. What impact did this have on you and the gentle nature that you had, and how did you change?
I think it changed me and my mum when it came out about the abuse many years later, decades later, and we've had discussions about it. She can actually pinpoint at the age of about 6 where I went from being a very tactile, loving little child, very curious about life, very adventurous, very spirited, to somebody who was subdued, difficult, against, very opposed to authority, and a stubbornness developed that, when I look back now, it was a stubbornness in a way that I made a decision that nobody would ever make me do anything I didn't want to do again. And I think I carried that throughout my life. But obviously for them it was very confusing, because it was like I was a different child. And I think I kept that growing up. I was very suspicious of grown-ups, of adults, in that materialised in school as well, you know. I didn't like big people, as I called them. I didn't like old people. And I think that I was broken. I was literally broken, and I think I had some very sharp edges.
Were there other ways that you manifested these changes? You know, you've told us about behaviour. Were there other things that you did, perhaps to cope or to protect yourself?
I used to bang my head a lot, because it was the only way that I could cope with things that were in my head. And as a very little child, as far as I was concerned, I just had all these things in my head. So if I hit my head, it felt like maybe they would go away. I carried that on for quite a while. I also, as I got into the teenage years, I started drinking quite heavily, even from a young age. And I think I immersed myself in I was very suicidal even as a teenager, and I would take overdoses constantly. But I think I was impulsive and a risk taker purposefully. So I would do things that people would say to me, don't jump off there. And I would jump off there, and it wasn't, I think there was an element to me that was wanting to self-sabotage.
Yes. How did your parents react to these changes in your behaviour, and what were your feelings towards them during what I can only imagine is a difficult period?
I think this is probably one of the saddest parts, is that for me, I blamed them. I felt that they left me there. I felt that they didn't protect me, and I developed I held them in the same esteem as I held my grandparents, that they weren't good people, and I changed on how I felt about them, which for them obviously was heartbreaking. It was, you know, there was a real void there within me. And all of a sudden they had this person that all of the time seemed to be engaging in behaviours that were damaging to me, getting me into trouble at school. And I was well liked at school. The teachers recognised that there was something, and I had an educational psychologist and I ended up having some input. But again, I was very hostile to that. I didn't trust them. But I think that at home, it was, again, they were big people, and big people to me were bad people. And I didn't want to do what they told me to do. And as far as I was concerned, it was their fault. And I think that kind of, it was seen in how I was very withdrawn from them emotionally. And I think that when we've talked, it broke their hearts, you know, into quite a lot of pieces.
There's Big Joe and there's Little Joe. And if I can ask you to look back, what are your feelings of the little girl that is and was Little Joe? How do you feel about her, looking back at that dark part of your journey?
I look after her now, you know, and for a lot of years, that little Joe, I couldn't look at, you know, I couldn't look at my childhood. I couldn't look at pictures of myself as a little child because it was like I was looking at somebody else, and it was like I felt an incredible, I still do, I feel a sadness. I feel that something was stolen from her, and that makes me incredibly sad. But I think that over the years, I also, as I got older into my teenage years, that little Jo, I was so angry at her because to me, why didn't she open her mouth? Why didn't she talk to somebody? Why didn't she tell somebody? Why didn't she put a stop to this? Not just for her, but for the other children that were there. And that was a big part of what I battled with, was the fact that maybe if little Jo, if you'd have just spoken, if you'd have come home and been brave enough to ignore what they told you, that they were going to give you, your parents would give you away, if you'd have just been brave and had some courage, then you could have told them and you might have saved those children from going through what they did, because they didn't have a voice. But, you know, neither did I. That voice was stifled and suffocated, and that little girl was frightened. And it took me a lot of years to be able to look at her and want to love her and want to say, even the little Jo that grew up into, you know, a young adult who made mistakes, was flawed, was, you know, chaotic at times, destructive, to be able to put my arms around her and say, you carried things, you can put it down now, because they were never yours to carry. And on occasions now, things do arise where sometimes I have a momentary, fleeting moment where I think, gosh, I wish I'd said something. And I have to go to that little Jo and I have to take her and sit her on my knee and put my arms around her and remind her that it wasn't her fault.
One of the things that you've spoken about is numbness, and you developed an early relationship with alcohol, and there will be people listening now who have that same relationship. Can you explain to us and educate us how that developed and what alcohol did for you?
I think for me, it very much, you know, when you have an anaesthetic and in that moment, you can't feel anything, you know, but like the anaesthetic, it wears off after a period of time. And it was the same with alcohol for me. It numbed momentarily. If things started, I tried to live separate to what had happened to me. But obviously that's not always possible to do. I tried to separate that little person from me. And what happened was, if anything came up, if anything started to arise or surface, alcohol for me, I had to drink alcohol to try and suppress that and numb it. It was like a pain relief to me. But obviously it's a depressant, and all that did was all these suicidal thoughts and all these dark thoughts that I had about my existence, about me being alive and me being here for what's my purpose? Is my purpose in this life simply to be abused, to be hurt, to be mistreated? And when I used to have alcohol, it used to perpetuate those feelings and make me feel like, actually, this isn't my purpose, and I'm going to take control of my life and I'm going to leave.
You've mentioned things about guilt and shame, and unfortunately that stigma still exists with all of the themes that we're exploring today. And one of the things I want to touch on is that of suicide. And also there were instances where you would take alcohol and pills and where that theme of shame came about with your parents. Can you tell us about one of those stories and of going to the emergency department?
I remember I had taken some pills along with a bottle of vodka in my bedroom, and my dad had come up and found me semi-conscious, and he dragged me down the stairs in panic. It wasn't in a violent way. He was absolutely petrified because I was quite unresponsive. And I remember they made me drink a pint of salted water to try and vomit up what I'd taken. And about 2 days later, and then they put me to bed and kind of said, you know, when is this going to stop? When are you going to stop doing these kind of things? Because it is killing us. And that further compounded my guilt about who I was and how I had evolved. And about 2 days later, I started to feel in a lot of pain. I ended up getting ambulance to hospital. And that was another difficult time because for them, they then felt guilty. They felt irresponsible. That somebody else had called them things that they weren't. They weren't those things. They were good, loving parents, but they were confused. They were wandering around in the dark, not knowing what to do for the best. And I think those things, then they made the gulf between us even wider, because then I think not only was I hostile towards them, but I think they started to become, you know, not hostile towards me, but just full of despair. We don't know what to do for you anymore, and we can't kind of continue like this.
And as you've alluded to, your abuse stopped occurring, which doesn't at all take away with what you had to experience and perhaps continue to experience. And you've touched on this theme of speaking up, and so many survivors of abuse are so often accused of not speaking up and not speaking to people. May I first ask, did your feelings change of going to your grandparents' home, where initially you were always so looking forward to going to them? Over this sustained period of abuse, did that eventually change?
It did, and when they had to come and stay with us, my mum went into hospital on a number of occasions. My dad worked, so they would come and look after us, and it was filled with dread. It was filled with dread, and by this point I had a younger brother, and obviously for me, my primary concern was to look after him. I used to go into his bedroom because my grandfather was very audacious, and he would, even whilst they visited us, he would come up into my room. So I used to hear him at the living room door open, and I would bolt into my brother's bedroom. I'd physically shake him to wake him up, you know, all right, like, and then I'd shout, my mum, Michael's crying, or Michael's awake, because he was little. So she would come up to tend to him.
Did there ever come a moment where you did confront your grandparents about the abuse that you were being sustained?
So my grandfather, they came to stay with us, and my mum and my grandmother had went out because I had a very close relationship, they did. And I was going swimming with my best friend, and, you know, what we used to do was we'd put our swimming costume on underneath our clothes, so we had, you know, we could maximise our swimming time. And I was in the bathroom putting on my costume, and he opened the door, and he tried to touch me, and I said no. And I don't know where it come from, and I don't know what it was in that moment, but it was just something like, this is my home, I'm tired of this. And I said no, and I pushed him off me, and he went to do it again. I said, if you touch me, I'm going to tell everybody everything. And he stood there and he kind of stood a little back and he looked at me, and it was again words that for a long time damaged me, more than the actual acts themselves. But he turned around and he said, well, you never said no before. And I kind of didn't, you know. I would probably say, this hurts, do I have to? But I never actually, I don't really think I can recall, maybe it's once, but I don't really recall saying no. And I think for me then, that instantly, it was like an arrow to my heart, where I felt, I never stopped this, and it suddenly became my fault.
And what followed after this, and what sort of stopped the abuse? Did it continue after this?
So it went on for a long, long time, but it just instantly stopped in that moment. I think it was about 6-7 months later, my grandfather got admitted to hospital, and he was quite delirious. They said he had Alzheimer's, and he kept asking for me, and I wouldn't go to see him. He lived quite a way away anyway, but I wouldn't go to see him. And then after he passed away, I didn't go to his funeral. But my grandmother came to see us after he'd passed away. And my parents were out. My dad was at work and my mum was out shopping. And she turned up. She was just on the doorstep. She'd been to see some of her family where we lived. And then she decided to call up and visit us. And I remember I was so shocked to see her, and I let her in and I made her a cup of tea. And I got the best crockery out, because that's what we did when they came. And I remember just sitting and just thinking, what do I do here? My mum phoned us, says, you know, Nana Irene's here. And she said, oh, I'm coming home in a taxi now anyway. And she came in and I went upstairs, and I don't really know what transpired. And my mum to this day says she can't really recall what occurred, but she never visited us again. You know, we never saw her again, and it was all very strange. But for me, it was a huge relief.
You know that I've been immeasurably moved by you, and the stories that you say and the things that you write, and for the long journey you've taken to be with us here today, and just how wonderfully that you've told your story. And I deeply wish that there was a way, or there were words, or there were things that I could say to show you just how grateful I am. And I know there are going to be so many people who are going to be helped by you. But there is someone who I think can say it better than I can.
Hi. Well, Sukh asked me to do this recording, and I want to start by saying, you know, I am so proud of you, Joe. You are incredible. You are just this beautiful human being that was put on the planet, and you light up people's worlds. You know, people will always remember you as being straightforward, strong, courageous, brave. But to me, you are a beautiful human being, and I love you so much. You have been amazing with me. You have been a wonderful wife, an amazing mum, and I thank you for that, because you never gave up on me, and I will always be here for you. I know that your life is different now, and that scares you every day. I see that. But please don't ever think that you are alone in this journey that you are on now, because you have so many people walking beside you and everybody's rooting for you. But I am taking every step with you. I have got you. I love you. Thank you for everything, Joe. You are amazing.
Love you so much. Thank you so much for everything.
Thank you, Sue.
Not at all.